Missy's lost mittens. Mr. Jupiter's class was bundling up for recess. Parkas, snow boots, hats, and scarves. Missy Place slipped on her zebra-striped jacket, then reached into her pocket for her black knitted mittens. She pulled out a wad of used tissues and a lint-covered lifesaver. "Oh no," gasped Missy, "not again." Dropping to her knees, she searched everywhere inside the Polynesian ceremonial slit drums, under the stuffed giant sloth, behind the brass astrolabe, on top of the piranha tank, and even in the shrunken head collection. But it was no use. "I've lost my mittens," she wailed. "Big deal," said Victoria, shrugging. "After all, they weren't special mittens, not like mine." Victoria held up a hot pink fur-lined pair. "Nobody's mittens are as special as my mittens." "But they're the 37th pair I've lost this week," sniffled Missy. "I guess that makes you a real loser," said Victoria. "Go away, Victoria," said Rose, and she patted Missy's arm. "It'll be okay." "No, it won't," moaned Missy. "My mom said if I lost another pair, she was going to diaper pin them to my sleeves like she does for Davy." Davy was Missy's little brother. He was in preschool. Just then Mr. Jupiter appeared. "Is there a problem, girls?" "Missy lost her mittens," said Rose. "Again," sighed Missy, and she wiped her nose on her sleeve. "Have you looked in the ceremonial slit drums?" asked Mr. Jupiter. Missy nodded. "And under the sloth?" Missy nodded again. "And behind the astrolabe, on top of the piranha tank, and even in the shrunken heads?" Missy sobbed. "I've looked everywhere." "Then there is only one place left," said Mr. Jupiter. "Lost and found." "Lost and found!" shrieked Missy. "I can't go to Lost and Found. I'll get lost, and I'll never get found." "Nonsense," said Mr. Jupiter. "It's true," said Rose. Located in the school's basement, Lost and Found was a graveyard of lunch boxes and windbreakers, umbrellas and spelling books, colored pencils, and macaroni art projects. The place was so dark, so big, so creepy that Aesop students stayed away from it like the way fourth grade boys stayed away from a Girl Scout meeting. And what happened to the kids who naively wandered into Lost and Found in search of his baseball bat or baseball mitt? No one knew for sure, but rumor had it that the skeleton hanging in the art science room had once been a bright, happy, normal kid who'd had the misfortune of blundering into Lost and Found. Now Missy begged, "You have to come with me, Mr. Jupiter, you have to." "Of course," he replied. After sending the rest of the class out to recess, Mr. Jupiter pulled a headlamp from his desk. "Left over from my spelunking days," he explained, and strapped it onto his pipe helmet. Minutes later, the two stood at the edge of Lost and Found's vast, inky blackness. The light from Mr. Jupiter's headgear barely pierced its gloom. Missy's heart pounded, and she clutched Mr. Jupiter's arm. "I don't need my mittens," she croaked. "Really, Mr. Jupiter, let's just go back." But Mr. Jupiter just patted her white-knuckled hand. "Nonsense," he said. "You must have your mittens, or your fingers will freeze." He stepped into the darkness that was Lost and Found and spelunked into the room's center and pulled on an overhead chain. The room filled with light. Missy gasped. The place looked magical, almost like Aladdin's cave. Instead of heaps of gold and mountains of jewels, however, there were heaps of snow boots and mountains of beanbag animals, and there wasn't a skeleton in sight. Missy's fears vanished. "Let's get started," said Mr. Jupiter, switching off his headlamp. "What do your mittens look like?" Missy shrugged. "You know, the usual." Mr. Jupiter nodded and began digging through a nearby pile while Missy pawed through a box. She found a paperback copy of Mr. Popper's Penguins, a headless Barbie doll, and a pair of swim fins. "Are these your mittens?" Mr. Jupiter suddenly cried. He held up a knitted gold pair covered in flashing pink sequins and shiny blue bows. When he tugged the left thumb, the mitten sang, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." Missy was enchanted by them. They were special, even more special than Victoria's. How she wished they belonged to her. But mine aren't as nice as those, she confessed. She and Mr. Jupiter went back to digging. A dirty sock, half a bologna sandwich, a cuckoo clock. Are these your mittens? Mr. Jupiter asked a few minutes later. He held up a fuzzy pink pair that looked like two pink pigs. The pig mittens had eyes, ears, and a snout, and oinked when Mr. Jupiter squeezed it. Missy adored them. She desperately wished that they were hers, but those aren't mine either, she admitted. Mine are black and knit and very, very boring. They dug some more. A pencil case, a stringless yo-yo, a triceratops tooth. I wondered where that had disappeared to, said Mr. Jupiter, and he pocketed the tooth and kept digging. Soon he held up a plain black knitted pair. Are these your mittens? He asked. Missy clapped her hands in delight. You found them, Mr. Jupiter. Thank you. She slipped them on. Perhaps, said Mr. Jupiter with a smile, you should have a few extra pairs in case you lose those again. He held out the musical mittens and the pig mittens. But don't those belong to someone else? She asked. Believe me, said Mr. Jupiter, your honesty has made you the true owner of these mittens. Missy grinned, then eagerly stripped off her old pair and slipped on the musical ones. After tucking the others carefully into her coat pocket, she raced out to recess. On the playground, Missy was the center of attention. Did you find any ghosts down there? Asked Humphrey. Any skeletons? Asked Lenny. Any trolls? Asked Calvin. Nope, replied Missy, but I did find these. She held up her hands so that everyone could admire her new mittens. They're so special, said Amisha, touching the bright sequins. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Really special, said Lil, trying one of the bows. Victoria's nostrils flared. The most special mittens I've ever seen, said Rose, and she hummed along with Twinkle, Twinkle. Victoria ground her teeth and turned pea green. The next morning, just before recess, Victoria hid her hot pink fur-lined mittens in the trash can. Mr. Jupiter, she said with a little sob, I've lost my mittens. Mr. Jupiter raised his eyebrows. Indeed, he said. Then we'd better check lost and found. Smirking, Victoria followed Mr. Jupiter to the basement. Mr. Jupiter began digging. Victoria watched. She tapped her foot impatiently. A few minutes later, Mr. Jupiter held up a glorious pair, made of sleek white fur and trimmed in gold and pearls. They played Beethoven's Fifth Symphony when the teacher shook them. Are these the mittens you lost, Victoria? Asked Mr. Jupiter, and he watched her closely. Oh, yes, trilled Victoria. Yes. Eagerly, she reached for the mittens. There they are, cooed a voice from the doorway. Victoria turned to see. Was it? Could it be? It was. It was Miss Turner looking. Victoria shook her head in disbelief. Almost glamorous in white fur, coat trimmed in gold braid and seed pearls. You found my kittens. You found my mittens, you naughty kittens, the librarian purred. She held out a bare hand to Mr. Jupiter. Would you help me put these on? Of course, said Mr. Jupiter. He slipped first the right mitten and then the left onto Mrs. Turner's hand. Like Cinderella's slippers, they were a perfect fit. But, but what about me? Yelled Victoria. I don't have any mittens. How unfortunate, said Mr. Jupiter. I guess you'll have to keep your hands in your pockets. Gnashing her teeth, Victoria huffed back up the stairs. But before going out to recess, she reached into the trash can for her old hot pink pair. Oh no, she wailed. Mr. Swill emptied the trash. And the moral of this story is honesty is the best policy, for sure.